So today, I just realized I always start off with so. Today we are going to discuss eras of film, cycles of film, and most notably, New Hollywood cinema. So we talk about the building blocks of film, cinematography, editing, and part of film studies is also learning about film history that I feel that film production at film schools are missing out on when they don't study, certain eras of film in different countries and throughout history. Um, what does it mean for a film to represent the zeitgeist? Again, that's my film festival, and it's what I've been pretty much obsessed with in my research and what I do in my career is that films are a cultural artifact, right? Like any work of art, archaeologists dig up statues and relics from the past and they can study a civilization based on these artifacts. So, what do films say about who we are as a culture by examining them in retrospective, hindsight? So, why do certain films come out at certain times just because producers are following the trends and they think something's going to make money? Let's release this now. And there's more to it than that. Clearly people do gauge, read the room and see what they think would be popular and try to produce films. And as you notice, when a certain film is popular, especially back in the 80s, there's a lot of rip-offs or remakes or kind of knockoff versions of that film. Like after Jaws, there was a myriad of underwater shark films, and same with Escape from New York. There was like Bronx Warriors, and again, all the slasher horror films of the 80s, with Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street and Halloween being the main slasher films, you'll see a whole myriad of knockoffs of slasher films where they try to take the formula from the original and just redo it again in a different variation, but it's not as significant. So what makes the original iconic and significant? What makes, Jaws the first blockbuster? What makes Star Wars so popular? And, that being said, what's really kind of significant right now, I just saw Top Gun Maverick and I was really excited to see it, but it was literally just a cut and paste of the original. And at the apex of the Reagan era, the original, you couldn't beat it. To me, it's still one of the greatest films of the 80s, arguably of all time. And this one was just kind of trying to cash in on that nostalgia because nostalgia is a powerful tool. Why do certain films come out at certain times? Why was there the French New Wave, Italian neorealism, the Australian New Wave? Why are there, at certain times, when Saw came out, there was the whole slew of, torture porn films and that kind of style of horror films. Why, culturally, do these films have certain significance in a certain country or a certain decade? And that can be said because we decide what came first, the chicken or the egg. Does art reflect who we are, or do we infuse our beliefs into the art? I did have a conversation with John Carpenter about this, about The Thing and many films in the early 80s having, when we're talking about genre, identity crisis and wondering who you are and not being quite sure if you are knowing what you are. Why in the 70s was there so many films about mistrust of the government with Watergate and the disillusionment of the 70s and Vietnam failure? Film after film after film about society going wrong, dystopian societies, THX 1138, Soylent Green, Logan's Run. So it's a great discussion, isn't it, to see if we are the ones that are fashioning the films that are coming out or vice versa. And, I had talked to John Carpenter about The Thing and identity and the AIDS epidemic. And he said he wasn't cognizant when he was making the film, but looking back, as a filmmaker, you're very aware of the zeitgeist, of what's in the ether, of what's going on. And if you're a good artist or filmmaker, you kind of take that out of the ether and infuse it into your work. And I think a good filmmaker, somebody that's very intuitive, will take that and turn it into art. And that's why it resonates with the public at large, with the collective consciousness, because we're all feeling it. Great Richard Linklater film, Waking Life. Ethan Hawke is having this discussion about, there was pyramids in Egypt and South America, but they never really talked to each other. So where do ideas come from when some people have the same idea? Is there this collective thought pool that we're all connected to, and artists kind of pull from that? And that's why it really compels everybody, because we're all feeling it, and they kind of, interpret it and turn it into something tangible. And then we identify with it because we too understand what's going on. I really believe that's what cinema is, and what makes good cinema and what makes it resonate is that the filmmaker or artist can transmit that frequency that we're all in tune to, but kind of articulate it in a way that we can understand in our waking life, when we're aware and can interpret the art. So that being said, I'm really fascinated with New Hollywood cinema, which is defined as 1965 to about 1980. Again, that's when Gen Xers were born, so funny enough. But so the classic Hollywood formula, Marlene Dietrich and Bette Davis, Joan Crawford, they all had studio contracts. MGM made certain films, Universal made certain films, Columbia made certain films. But all good things must come to an end. So the studio system was losing money. In the 60s, the French New Wave came out. Godard, Breathless was a huge game changer. Italian neorealism, people wanted that more independent film and more, kind of avant-garde, not just the formulaic movie star Hollywood that had been churning out for decades. So the studio system in America was starting to crumble. And this was a time where studio execs were kind of scrambling around. And at the same time, you had these like movie school darlings, Lucas, Coppola, De Palma, Spielberg are coming out, and they have this like film school knowledge, and they care about the classics and the greats, but then they have all these great new ideas. And so for me, this is the golden age of Hollywood for me, because this is when you had independent filmmakers, independent films with the studio budget. So they were taking chances in, back in the day, in the classic Hollywood golden era, it was very formulaic. You're not going to see much diversion from what they know is going to sell. But here we have films like The Exorcist being made, Jaws, Star Wars, and Easy Rider. We're going to be watching Network. Bonnie and Clyde, Warren Beatty, famous story, was going to die on that hill, and he's like, I'm going to make this film. And studio execs were, at first, it's an anecdote in this book, which I'll talk about in a bit, kind of like shaking their head like, no, and then at the end of the day, kind of shaking their head, okay, because it was a different time. People were ready for something more significant. And coming out of, if you know anything about American history, this was a tumultuous time, the late 60s and the 70s. It was a very transitional era, more rights for minorities, and Stonewall for gay people, the women's rights movement. And it was just it was a shift in who we were. And so the movies were going to reflect that, because the old formula and the old way of doing things didn't work anymore. So people were taking chances. And, typical Hollywood ending, happy ending, most of the new Hollywood cinema, the endings are not, they're a little bit more bleak, but that's reflecting who we were and what we were feeling in, the Watergate era, the Vietnam era, and just mistrust in our social institutions. Kind of like where we are today. So it's going to be really interesting to see in hindsight the films that are coming out currently. So when you do see a film that just is trying to take like Top Gun and redoing it, it just doesn't ring true, because it's just not who we are, right? You gotta see a film that is reflecting what we're doing now. And if you're just trying to cash in on nostalgia, you can't recreate magic. It's magic because of that indescribable something. And if we all knew, then every film would be, a hit. But it takes something more than just, cutting and pasting something formulaic that worked before and just doing it again. That's why I'm really kind of against reboots and remakes, because I don't feel that you can't take something that was awesome and just do it again with a different cast and then call it a day and expect it to make money and expect it to, be magic. But I digress. So I think the best book that captures this era is Peter Biskind, Easy Riders, Raging Bulls, How Sex, Drugs, and Rock and Roll Generation Saved Hollywood. This is anecdotal. It's just how everything, when they talk about alignment and just the stars were in alignment, this is that time in Hollywood where everything just kind of worked out perfectly. And we're never going to see this again because studios are now doing the big tentpole films. And in the 90s, there was the big, Miramax, and independent studios started doing the more indie films. And so there was this divergence of what type of film Hollywood would produce. So you're not going to see like a Flashdance or a Dirty Dancing ever again. They're going to leave that to other studios, which is sad because now you're just seeing Marvel films and, big blockbusters coming out of Hollywood when you're not reaching the audiences with the independent films because they have a more limited distribution, a more limited release, or they go straight to streaming. And now streaming, people are like, oh, did you see this movie? Did you see this show? Well, there's like 40 channels to choose from. Whereas if a film like Chariots of Fire on Golden Pond came out in the early 80s, and you're at the movie theater watching, Return of the Jedi or another film, you may see the trailer and go see that as well. So there was more, I think, exposure to the public of independent films than there are today. Yes, you can see films at a festival or again on streaming, but I think the public at large is missing out so much more without having these lower budget films released in mass theaters. So Bonnie and Clyde and The Graduate are considered the initiators of this era in 1967. And, then you were getting MASH and The French Connection, The Last Picture Show, The Godfather. And before anyone realized it, it says here, it was a movement. So kind of just all happened at once. Like everything was just aligning and all these like bright young filmmakers were just coming out with amazing content and the public was just eating it up. Something like The Exorcist would never have been made, in the 50s. And so a lot of this is called the film school generation, the movie brats, which is Scorsese, Spielberg, Terrence Malick, Paul Schrader, John Milius, and, all the big names that you probably have heard of. This was their era. This is when they were young students. This is when they were up and coming. And this is when they had something to prove, but had nothing to lose, right? Like they didn't have anything to lose, so they could take the chances. They're getting money from the studios to go ahead and make a film about a shark. Go ahead and make a space opera about Star Wars. What the heck is that? It was really an amazing time, and this is my favorite era of cinema. And I think this is when Hollywood was at its best. This is for me, the golden era. And a lot of other film scholars agree that this is when America had the best cinema because it really was in tune with the era and the age. So we'll see a video about some of the films that really encapsulated the ideology of the era. But we're going to be watching Network. And what I really want you to look at in Network, and this is, I believe Faye Dunaway is amazing. Ned Beatty. It is just such an amazing film, and I really love sharing it with my classes because I really think that a good film withstands the test of time and is still relevant to who we are. And if you can extrapolate the themes from this film and put it into social media context, it is still relevant. about information, the public at large just listening to what we're told. In network, it's through the television, the TV, the power, the people that disperse information have. And if you're not a critical thinker, and if you're not thinking about the messages you're receiving, bombarded with on a daily basis, then you can be indoctrinated. You can be susceptible to propaganda. And so if you just want to be numb and just come home after work and just turn on the tube and be brain dead, then how is culture going to withstand a population that does that? So Network for me is really a relevant film then, and it is today, as to the powers that be manufacturing and controlling the disbursement of information. And the famous scene of we're goddamn mad and we're not going to take it anymore. It's still chilling for me to watch. So really pay attention to how this film represented contested mainstream philosophy of the 70s, right? Because we are being told, and I think a big one was Nixon lying to us. But now, in the post-truth era, we don't know what's true or what is anymore. And who are we to trust? Where do we get information? We say information is at our fingertips. It's all over the internet. But what is editorialized anymore? What is, true and what isn't? And are we being educated enough to be able to tell the difference? So I really find Network to be one of the most important films of the new Hollywood era, because it is still really relevant today. I mean, Easy Rider was great, Midnight Cowboy is great, but sometimes when you look back, they seem a little dated, or that was really cool for the time, but I don't know if that's important now. Whereas Network, I think, is more important now than ever, especially Ned Beatty's monologue. And who do you think is, running the show? So I'm really excited to see thoughts and comments on this. And also, when you watch a film, I want you to be cognizant of what's going on right now, culturally, globally, and is that being infused into even a Marvel film? Even any film or any TV show that you watch now cannot be in a void. It can't be in a vacuum. It's going to be a product of the collective of what we're doing. So that's basically my mission, is for you as a viewer to just realize what you're watching and kind of filter it and process it. And why does it ring true? Why does it sit well? Why doesn't it sit well? And then maybe revisit something from 5 years ago. And in retrospect, pre-COVID, did that ring true? Does it still? So just being a more literate viewer and being able to process that and understand what good cinema and art entails is what film studies is about. So I hope you enjoy Network and the clip on New Hollywood Cinema that I'm going to include. And thank you so much for listening.